Okay, this is Titanic 110 Years of Media by me, Paul Germini. This is for Connecticon 2022. This is a test recording. I'm going to basically run through my slides and hopefully speak in a somewhat cogent manner and see if I can get it all done in an hour. So, what are we here for? What are we doing? Well, Titanic is still interesting. It's 110 years later, and people are still making games about it. They're still writing books about it. There'll be more movies, I'm sure, in the future. So, why is that? And if we can skip a bit to the end, I'm going to spoil it and say I don't have a great answer for that. But I do think one way we can start to try and answer that question is look at everything that's been made and try and figure out what these things think are important, what they think are not important, and perhaps we can figure it out by doing that. So this is going to be a bit of a survey of basically Titanic media. I'm going to talk for about an hour and show slides. If you're not interested, that's okay. I'm sure a lot of fun and exciting things are going on right now. So I won't be upset if you leave either this video or the forthcoming presentation. So what are we looking at here? This is the iceberg that sunk the Titanic. We're not sure that is exactly true. There were a couple icebergs that there are photographs of that some of the rescue ships took pictures of. One point in favor of this is that a lot of people looked on the left here and saw what appears to be a red smudge, which might be paint from the Titanic's impact. We'll never know for sure, but it's a good candidate. So what are we going to do today? I'm going to talk about who I am. We're going to briefly go over the Titanic history. I'm going to explain what's not covered. We're going to do a big media overview. We're going to look at Titanic on the small and large screen, Titanic on the stage, Titanic in video games, audio dramas, board games, and then one little miscellaneous Titanic thing. Then, if I've timed everything all right, we'll have a conclusion and Q&A. If you have questions as I present, feel free to raise your hand or yell at me if I'm not noticing, and I will try and answer them. So who am I? I'm not a historian. I'm just really interested in the Titanic. I've got a high tolerance for bad media. If you'd like me to prove that, you can come to my panel. Does Star Trek porn make good Star Trek? 9:45 on Saturday, sorry. I also love watching people get hit with water, which happens quite a lot in Titanic. And I'm trying to justify spending $650 on the Titanic Lego set. So some brief history of Titanic. Started construction in 1909, completed in 1912, sunk famously in its maiden voyage in the early morning, April 15th, 1912. Took 2 hours and 40 minutes to sink. About 1,500 dead out of the 2,200 or so passengers and crew, and the wreck was found in 1985. So what damage did the Titanic take? We know it hit an iceberg, and it actually ruptured the first 5 compartments here on the starboard side of the ship, so that's the right side. It was designed to survive 2 compartments being flooded, so of course, once there were more than 2, it was in bad shape. It could possibly have survived with 4 compartments, but not 4 consecutive compartments like we see here. And so basically what happened is when this side gets ripped open, all these compartments flood, and because of the design of the Titanic, the watertight bulkheads only go up a certain number of decks. So water would cascade from one compartment to the next, and eventually the whole ship would sink. Right, so it's important to understand some of the safety equipment on Titanic. There were 20 lifeboats, of which 14 were standard lifeboats. So the standards are up here in the corner. And then there were 4 collapsible lifeboats over here. They have this like canvas side that you can collapse down and then bring up. And then there were 2 cutters, which are slightly smaller lifeboats. Fully loaded, the capacity of the lifeboats would have 1,178 people, and the legal minimum at the time was 16 lifeboats. So Titanic was technically above board for the amount of lifeboats it legally was required to have. Life vests, enough for everyone on the Titanic, made of cork and canvas. They were effective, but the cork's rather hard. So if you were to, say, jump from a ship and land in the water, you could suffer a serious injury as your head would hit the cork on the life vest. And so here are a couple examples. There's not many surviving examples of Titanic life vests, but there are a few. And they're usually wrong in the film, so something to look for. Cold water survival. So we know that the night the Titanic sank, the water was about 28 degrees, negative 2 degrees Celsius. And so at that temperature, you basically will die in 30 minutes. It's Some people did survive longer than that and were rescued, but most people could not. And there's a quote from Lawrence Beasley, who we'll see later in this presentation. And he said, I think the last of them must have been heard nearly 40 minutes after the Titanic sank. So that's roughly in line with what science tells us, which would be they wouldn't survive more than 30 minutes. If we look at the losses Titanic suffered, you can see, if you're a first class woman, there were 140 survived and only 4 died. So you've got a pretty good shot there. If you were, say, a third class male, most of those people died. So pretty bad odds for them. We'll see this theme, sort of classism, as one of the major motifs in Titanic media. And it's interesting to see this sort of charted out. Like, basically, as you go down in the classes, your odds of survival get worse and worse. And let us not forget the crew. They also did not fare very well. You can see, almost 700 people out of 885 died. So why is this class disparity? Well, it really has to do with the design of the ship. You can see the first class compartments are actually very close to the top of the ship, which is the boat deck, which is where all the lifeboats were. So as the order to evacuate was given, and that disseminates throughout the ship, the first people who are going to be at the lifeboats are actually the first class people, just because they're the closest. And the third class cabins are basically the furthest away. So, it's mostly a function of location. It's also a function of the fact that Titanic was kind of a confusing ship to navigate. One of the officers even said it took him about 2 weeks to figure out where everything was. Of course, there is some classism at play. First and second class was looked after before the third. And in this report I read from Wayne and Hall, there was some unsystematic exclusion by the crew. So you can sort of understand this crew, they're on their maiden voyage. They're sort of dealing with a very rapidly developing situation. It can be sort of hard to figure out what specifically you're supposed to do. And immigration laws at the time in the U.S. actually specifically said that the third class had to be separated from the other classes, just as a way of dealing with disease. So that's why we see in media sometimes the third class sort of literally locked down in their areas, although it's not exactly factual, except for these unsystematic exclusions. Just a brief discussion on the crew. We know the captain of the Titanic, Edward Smith. Some say Titanic would be his last voyage. Extremely experienced, had an excellent safety record. Certainly looks the part of a captain with the beard. One of White Star's most, famous employees, if you will. Charles Lighthauler. He is Titanic's second officer, and he's the highest-ranking surviving crew member. So a lot of the information we have on what the crew was doing comes from him. And he's responsible for loading the lifeboats on one of the sides of the Titanic. I like to include John Priest. He was part of the crew. He's a stoker. He doesn't show up in any of the films, but he's notable because he survived 4 sinkings, of which the Titanic was his first. So just a string of bad luck. Well, it was bad luck that he was involved in the sinkings, but good luck that he actually survived them all. And we have the band. The band shows up all the time in Titanic media. Not technically part of the crew. They're contracted by White Star through this company called CW and FN Black. And they traveled second class. 8 members, all lost. Notable passengers, J. Bruce Ismay. He's chairman of the White Star. He's basically the highest White Star sort of corporate official on the ship at the time. And he is commonly scapegoated for the disaster. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. He would survive, so, it's definitely a bad look for him to survive. well, so many people died. And we have Thomas Andrews. He's the chief Titanic designer for Harland and Wolff. Harland and Wolff built the Titanic, and he was present on the maiden voyage. John Jacob Astor IV, probably the richest man in the world at the time, certainly on the Titanic, and he was traveling with his 19-year-old wife at the time. His wife would survive, he would not. And Margaret Brown, otherwise known as the unsinkable Molly Brown, she's famous for forcing her lifeboat to return to look for additional survivors. She's commonly portrayed as boisterous and eccentric, sort of your classic loud-talking American character, if you will. And there were a couple ships involved with the Titanic disaster, most notably the RMS Carpathia, owned by the Cunard Line, which was a competitor to White Star at the time. It rescued the Titanic survivors a few hours after the Titanic had sunk. And there's this other ship, the SS California. It was said to be only a few miles from the Titanic at the time of the sinking, but did not respond to the Titanic's distress calls. A lot of ships at the time only had one wireless operator, so the wireless operator had gone to bed at night, and a lot of the crew think they might have seen the Titanic, but didn't really understand what was going on, so sort of a famous what if. If they had responded, they were likely very close and could have saved a lot of people. But they didn't, so. Now let's talk media. So what's not covered? I'm not going to cover any of the books. I'm not going to cover any of the documentaries. And there's no Titanic sideshows, as I refer to them. You've got to include the sinking. Some media has like a 5-minute Titanic thing, just to like set the stage for a particular character, or it comes up as a plot point. I'm going to classify those as sideshows. You know, we sort of want Titanic as the main attraction, if you will. So here's a timeline of all Titanic media. I'm not going to go through it all. But the important thing to realize is the Titanic sinks in 1912, and there's basically sporadic showings. When the 50-year anniversary comes up, there's sort of this glut. And then it's sort of a pretty steady trickle upwards. So not a lot of stuff in the first 50 years, but in the second half, it's really weighted that way. Just by the numbers, we got 8 movies, 2 animated films, 10 TV shows, 11 video games, 3 musicals, 3 plays, 4 audio dramas, and surprisingly enough, 13 board games. All right, so let's look at Titanic on the small and large screen. First up, we've got Saved from the Titanic in 1912, released only a month after the disaster, May 16th, 1912. It's 10 minutes long and is unfortunately lost, so I couldn't see it, which is rather disappointing. So it's the only film I didn't see. It stars this person, Dorothy Gibson. She was actually on the Titanic the night of the disaster, and she's one of the first people to leave the ship via lifeboat. One of her last films, sadly enough. And this is a promotional image over here, and this is what she was wearing the night of the disaster. So probably the most historical character you'll see in a Titanic film. All we've got are reviews, so a rather positive review by the Moving Picture World. Nerve-wracking task, but like actresses before, the Footlights, this beautiful young cinematic star valiantly conquered her own feelings and went through the work. A surprising and artistically perfect reel has resulted. Of course, we have our detractors, the bare idea of undertaking to reproduce in a studio, no matter how well equipped, or be reenacted sea scenes, an event of the appalling character of the Titanic disaster, with its 1,600 victims, is revolting. So I sort of get what the New York Dramatic Mirror is getting at. It is a little strange that this would come out a mere month later. Next up, we have In Night and Ice, or The Sinking of the Titanic from 1912. This isn't that far away from the first film, released in August, but I guess maybe a couple months later. It was a lost film until 1998, and it's 35 minutes. I like to show a shot of the Titanic, since these are all Titanic related, and they all have Titanic shots. Pretty decent model, I'll say. Good for the time. This is definitely not the Titanic in the left here, and we can tell because the funnels are sort of weirdly spaced. So I'm not sure what ship that is, but okay, model. I would say pretty watchable. They've got these cool rocking sets you can see. The rocking is probably a little pronounced for the size of the Titanic, but it was neat. And, it's pretty quick, 35 minutes. You can get in and out. As far as historical notes, Titanic was hitting the wrong side. We know that Titanic contacted the iceberg on the starboard side or the right side. Here we see it being hit on the port side. Not right. We also know in this version that the captain was asleep at the time of the disaster, but in this film he's shown as awake, which is actually rather common in a lot of Titanic films. Next up we have Atlantic, or Titanic, Disaster in the Atlantic. It's the first true film, and I'll call it a true film just because of its length. It's about 90 minutes, and it's got sound to it. It has a German version called Atlantic, and it's based on a play, The Berg, which we will see later. It's technically set on a ship called the Atlantic, but it's generally marketed as a Titanic film, and the play it's based on is on the Titanic, so I'm counting it. You might not. Everyone really assumes that this is about the Titanic, so I think it counts. The ship, we don't see a lot of it, and the film quality's not great, but it is there. This is a film I think is probably the worst of the lot. It's not aged particularly well. The audio it comes and goes. It's not great, but it was an early talkie film, so I guess it's expected. It's a little dull. You can definitely see the roots in the fact that it is a play, and it's rather disjointed. There are scenes set in the bar, and there are scenes set with the ship sinking, and there's really not a lot of connection between the two. It's a lot more drama than disaster film. We see the captain on the right here, and he's got no beard, which is rather disappointing to me. I will say, though, very nice watertight doors. A lot of films sort of cheap out on the watertight doors, and I think they went and actually produced a fairly faithful replication here. So here are the doors on the right. We also have the first appearance of the band. Of course, they're playing a lot of brass instruments, which isn't correct, but, it's their first appearance, so I'll give them a little leeway. Okay, now we have Titanic, 1943. You can think of this one as the Nazi one, as it was made by the Nazi Empire at the time. 85 minutes, and a lot of clips from this film will be used in future films and TV shows, so it's fairly influential in the fact that clips are used fairly frequently in future films, and it would also create sort of the boilerplate Titanic film. We can see a lot of the themes films in the future would investigate are present in this film. Of course, like anything associated with the Nazis, it's got a rather messy history. Director was arrested and found hung in prison during the production, probably because he had insulted Goebbels at the time. He's the Reichsminister of Propaganda. It was shown in German-occupied territory like France, but not in Germany itself. It was felt maybe we shouldn't show a big disaster film while our own cities are being bombed. And the stand-in ship for the Titanic, the SS Cap Arcona, was actually sunk like a week or two before the war in Europe ended. There's about 5,000 casualties from that sinking. So, yeah, that ship did not have a good ending. That said, though, good stand-in. We can see a pretty faithful replication of the Titanic on film. And a really good shot here, Titanic, lifeboats. I mean, that's a popular shot. You're going to see that all the time. This is probably the best of the early shots. As far as how it is watchable, it's rather long. As a propaganda film, it's didactic, so it has a point it's trying to make. So they spend a lot of time talking about how greedy the British are and how their greed influenced this disaster. And you do see some of the early sort of class struggle at play where the rich are sort of afforded spots in the lifeboats while the poor sort of struggle to survive. There's this ahistorical character we have here, Peterson. Of course, as a German propaganda film, we have to have a righteous German officer who can see what's going to happen and tries to fix it but can't because of sort of the evil machinations of one Bruce Ismay. So we mentioned him before. This is the first film that sort of very strongly blames him for the disaster, and you'll see that theme repeated in future films. Overall, sort of an interesting historical footnote, but you can skip it if you like. Yeah, so we start to see some of the class struggles here with all the third-class passengers being kept back. Now we have Titanic 1953, 98 minutes long. This is the romantic drama one. This is a good film, but not a good Titanic film. It has a very good ship shot, and a lot like the Nazi Titanic film before this one, we will see shots from this film used in future films. I'd say, yeah, I said it. Good movie, bad Titanic movie. It takes about an hour for the ship to be hit, and it's only 98 minutes, so there's not a lot of disaster at play. The actor Clifton Webb, though, as Richard Sturgis, is great. So it's a good drama film. It's really about this guy, Richard, who's trying to get his kids back after his wife basically steals them, tries to take them to America, and he's just a very engaging, enjoyable character. As far as the history side goes on it, we see the captain's awake during the crash again, which wasn't true. When the Titanic went down, a lot of the characters remarked that the boilers are exploding. That's not true. The boilers did not explode that night. And they also claim that the Titanic was sold out on this maiden voyage. It was only half sold at the time. And this is not a collapsible lifeboat, and this is not a watertight door. You remember I mentioned how some films cheap out on watertight doors. This is a great example on cheaping out. And yeah, we looked at the collapsible lifeboats. That ain't it, son. We got some small details there. It likely did not happen, but some survivors claimed that a man or a couple men tried to dress as women and get on a lifeboat. So that scene in this film, this may or may not be true. There's little evidence for it, but it was possible. We have our first TV show here, The Sinking of the Titanic, from a series called You Are There, which was active from 1947 to 1957. It had 147 episodes, and this one aired in 1955. It's 25 minutes long. We only see the ship once, and this is not the Titanic, so kind of a disappointing way to set the stage. I mean, we know that because these funnels look wrong, and there's only 3 of them. My report, very cool live reporting format. We've got Walter Cronkite here. The premise of this show is, what if we had reporters on the Titanic during the night of the disaster and they were reporting on things and interviewing characters? It's a really cool idea. If you'd seen the film Culloden, there's basically a similar idea present here. It's pretty accurate to the event, and a couple real-life characters show up that I haven't mentioned, like Isidore Strass, but we'll talk about him in a bit. So here we see Smith and Ismay. Small details, this guy called Frederick Maxfield Hoyt shows up. He loaded his wife in collapsible lifeboat D, which was the last lifeboat to launch from the ship. And then after it had been lowered, he jumped after her and got into the boat, which is kind of an interesting way to work around, and an interesting way to work around only women and children being allowed on the lifeboat. So I give him props for that. We have A Night to Remember by Kraft Television Theater. This is a TV anthology series, and they made a ton of episodes, 650. This one in particular, Season 9, Episode 25. It's about an hour long, and it won a single Emmy, and it's based on the book A Night to Remember. The quality's not great. We only see the ship briefly. Sort of looks like the Titanic if you took it with a very poor camera. I mean, it's only an hour long, so there's not really enough build-up at play. We hit the iceberg 15 minutes in, and it's a TV show, so it's kind of cheap. And you can see this shot in particular is reused from the 1943 Titanic film. It is very accurate to the events, though, although I will say when the ship hit the iceberg, a bit too jarring. A lot of passengers on the Titanic didn't even realize they'd hit stuff, and even people more forward in the boat didn't really register the hit. So it's also the first appearance of the Californian. As you remember, the Californian, closest ship to the Titanic, but didn't respond to the distress call. It does include this small detail with George Thomas Rowe. He's the quartermaster, and he's actually stationed on the very far end of the ship. And you know how I mentioned a lot of people didn't even realize they had hit an iceberg. He's on the back and he realized the ship had stopped, but he didn't know why. And then he saw a lifeboat go by and he called up to just figure out what was going on. So it's widely assumed he was the last man to actually learn what was going on. But he did survive the sinking, so. Another TV show, The Unsinkable Molly Brown, from the show called Telephone Time. Also an anthology series from 1956 to 1958. 81 episodes. Pretty brief, at 12 minutes long. Yeah, they just reused the shots from the 1943 Titanic film. I mean, if you've got a 12-minute show, you're not going to pay to have your own ship or even a model. It's pretty quick, right? There's really not a lot to talk about. This is the first film to really have Molly Brown up in center, and she was, after the Titanic sinking, she was a popular media figure, but this is her first real appearance in film. And at 12 minutes, basically Titanic Cliff Notes. So if you want to watch, one film while you're waiting in line, this would be it. The actor who plays Molly Brown, this Cloris Leachman, she actually would reprise her role in 1970's SOS Titanic 22 years later, and we will talk about that film in a bit. We've also got Isidore and Aida Strauss. They're Macy's co-owners, and it is claimed that when Isidore tried to put Aida on a lifeboat that she said, "We have lived together for many years, and where you go, I go." So that story has been repeated in a lot of press. It's a fairly popular story. They, of course, did not survive the sinking of the Titanic. But there is a park for them in New York. And this is a statue in that park of Aida. We come to A Night to Remember from 1958. This is my favorite one, so I will talk about it for a bit. It's definitely the most accurate one. About 2 hours, and it's based on the book A Night to Remember. So we saw the Kraft television series A Night to Remember. This is basically the remake of that, double the length, quadruple the budget. Very famous film. Didn't make a ton of money, but it's my favorite. So, of course, we've got a great shot of the Titanic sailing and sinking. They did great work on that. Yeah, I've said it like 3 times already. It's the best Titanic film. It's really more focused on events than characters, so it has a somewhat documentary feel to it. And it's got this really great scene where Andrews is meeting the captain and laying out all the damage. And he basically plots out the whole situation and how the Titanic's going to sink and how the rest of the movie's going to play out. And a lot of future films are going to steal basically this exact scene. So exceedingly accurate. A lot of time spent on the Californian, so you get a really good sense of how they thought, what they thought was happening, and how they were responding to the situation. And there's even a fair bit of time spent post-sinking, which is unusual for these films. Here we have Bruce Ismay looking at the Titanic. It was said that he couldn't watch the ship sink, so this is probably an ahistorical shot, but it is a good shot nonetheless. Small details with Andrews here. So Andrews, he's the ship designer. Reportedly last seen by John Stewart, a steward on the ship, by at approximately 2:05 a.m. Andrews was standing alone in the first-class smoking room with his arms folded, his life belt lying on a nearby table. Stewart asked him, "Aren't you going to have a try for it, Mr. Andrews?" Andrews didn't answer or move, apparently in a state of shock. So that scene is in the film, and this is a rather popular scene. So we'll see, in the James Cameron Titanic film and in SOS Titanic, basically the same scene recreated. We also got this guy, author Godfrey Piuchen, in Lifeboat 6. So Light Hauler lowered Lifeboat 6, and a lot of the passengers in the lifeboat said they didn't have enough oarsmen. So Light Hauler basically asked the people around him, all these men, if there was, an able seaman. And this guy stepped forward. He was part of a yachting club. So he jumps on this rope and shimmies down onto the boat. It's one of the only men Light Hauler would let on a lifeboat that time. Yeah, sort of. We talk about confusion in loading the lifeboats. He interpreted the women and children only command as a strict command, so he wouldn't let men on the boats, even if there were spots. The guy on the other side, Murdoch, he was a bit looser with it, so it was more women and children first with him, and then if there were spots and men available, then he would let men on. And there's this neat production detail I found. We talked about Lawrence Beasley. He had the quote earlier about all the survivors in the ocean dying. He was a survivor from the second class, and he was on the set during filming. And at one point, when the sinking was being filmed, he attempted to enter the scene and symbolically go down with the ship. But the director didn't allow it, which, unfortunate but understandable. Now we have our first musical, The Unsinkable Molly Brown. It's based on the 1960s musical. It's about 2 hours long. They're using their ship shots from the Atlantic film. And I'm going to say one of the more disappointing films. For a musical, there's not a lot of sinking, and Margaret Brown is a rather annoying character in the film. She's mostly portrayed as this kind of annoying social climber character. And there's very little actual Titanic. Titanic only shows up for about 5 minutes. It's really more about Molly Brown's life, which apparently started with her surviving a flood as a baby, which I'm not sure is that true. Disappointing, this film. Arguably shouldn't be included in this list, but I felt Molly Brown's such an important character, we should. So I did. Rendezvous with Yesterday, The Time Tunnel. This is a cool show, short-lived, 1 season, 30 episodes, and this is the first episode. It's about these people who have a literal time tunnel, and they can go back in time. We don't see a lot of the Titanic, and what we do see is somewhat obscured. So we only have these shots, but it looks okay. I had a lot more fun with this than I thought it would be. It's a fun time-traveling story. One of these guys basically accidentally ends up on the Titanic, and then the other guy has to go back and get him. The interiors aren't so great. Sort of like Titanic, as if it were a hotel in the 60s. And there's also a bunch of explosions that were happening. That's pretty ahistorical, as we've talked about with the 1953 Titanic film. Groovy show, though. A lot of cool shots. Definitely a lot of production budget in this show. I'm looking forward to watching more episodes of it. We have SOS Titanic from 1979. Yeah, this is the forgettable TV movie version. It is the first film in color, though. The ship shot, it looks great standing still, but in motion, not great. It's competent, it's watchable, but it feels long, and the ships don't look that great. You can see on here, this is not the Titanic deck. Interesting storyline, though. We have stories in all 3 classes. We have stories about the Astors, and stories in the second class and the third class. Kind of cool. There's a lot of time spent on the Carpathia after they're rescued, and it's got the most focus of the Astors in any film. Titanic sets, not quite right, but, they made do with the budget they had, I suppose. One of the cool details they captured is Boat 13. Boat 13 was lowered in the water, but it got sort of caught up in the ropes, and it drifted under this other boat, so they actually almost lowered a second lifeboat on top of it. But luckily one guy had a knife on him, so he was able to cut the ropes loose. Very close to having a lifeboat disaster there. And definitely speaks to how sort of hurried and not as expertly trained. The crew wasn't experts in lowering the lifeboats at the time. And we've got David Warner. He's in this, and he'll show up later in the 1997 Titanic film. So look for that. I love David Warner, so... We have Voyagers of the Titanic, 1 season, 20 episodes. These people travel through time, and they generally stop at a certain time, and something is wrong with the timeline there, so they have to fix it. And in this case, the Mona Lisa somehow ended up on the Titanic, and they have to save it. So they use the shot of the Titanic from one of the earlier films, and then they use this shot, which is clearly not the Titanic, but... if you look at it quickly and you aren't familiar enough, it might pass. It's more comedic than serious, like the Time Tunnel is, and it's got a rather annoying child character. I've never really liked child characters in film, so it has that negative against it. It's also got this weird side story about Pasteur and rabies. I don't know why they thought to include that, but they did. Again, Titanic, interior, not that great. And they're also not big fans of Bruce Ismay. They sort of conflated that story about a man escaping on a Titanic dressed as a woman, and suppose that Ismay escaped that way. We know that's not true, but it is what it is. The band shows up, and they do have some stringed instruments this time, but there's not a lot of cool small details in this particular Titanic interpretation. We have the 1996 Titanic miniseries, 2 parts, 173 minutes long, so I hope you have a lot of time. This is basically the poor man's 1997 Titanic. They have a lot of the same ideas. They just don't execute on them as well. But Tim Curry's in it. I love Tim Curry. He of course plays an evil character in this TV series, but he's great. I think we just need more Tim Curry in our lives. Pretty decent ship shot. This is the first of the CG Titanics we'll see. For 97 CG, it's okay. Certainly doesn't hold up very well nowadays, but we can even see accurately how the fourth smokestack does not produce steam. Yeah, well, I said this basically Titanic with less budget. There's also no cross-class romance like we'll see in that film. Some very annoying characters, bad SIP CGI. Only movies to show scenes in New York, which is kind of interesting. All the survivors, of course, would end up in New York, brought there by the Carpathia. And this is the first to show the ship splitting in half, which is neat. A lot of people, we saw in the earlier films, a lot of people thought the ship went down in one piece. But after the wreck was discovered in 85, we know that the ship split in half. So, and even some of the survivors said it split in half. So it's a little weird why it took this long to realize that. But there's also a lot of post-sinking content, which I find interesting. Because a lot of the films focus just on the sinking, but there's interesting stories after the sinking as well. Small details, collapsible boat B. I mentioned how collapsible D was the last boat launched. There were still lifeboats on the ship at the time, but none of them, there were 2 of them, none of them launched correctly. Collapsible boat B is one. They were trying to lower it from one deck to another, and they flipped it over, and then the deck got covered in water. So everybody who was nearby just tried to climb on top of it, and that's where Lightaller survives. He's on top of collapsible B for the night as it slowly sinks in, waiting for people to rescue him. This is a picture of collapsible B being recovered. Yeah, there's this weird shot at the end where they say all attempts to raise it have failed. To my understanding, no one has ever tried to raise the Titanic, so I don't know why that's mentioned. It seems strange and out of character. All right, we're at the halfway mark. I see I spent 37 minutes here. Ideally, this would have been 30 minutes, but let's keep going. So we've got this is the 1997 Titanic film. James Cameron, it's the famous one. It won all the awards. It made all the money. But it's pretty good. It's also very long. Of course, they spent all the money to make a gorgeous ship. They had, a giant ship set, and every time the Titanic shows up, it looks great. So this is probably the high water mark for the ship appearing in film. Extremely watchable, very long. I've always liked its unique setup. It's cool how you sort of see these Titanic treasure hunters. I would have liked a little more disaster and a little less drama, but the film probably made all its money on the drama, so very detail-oriented, great production values. Not very sympathetic to Lightaller or Murdoch. Those are the 2 officers who were loading the boats on either side. But we can see we've got Ismay in this shot, we've got Molly Brown in this shot, and we got Andrews in this shot. So, a lot of small details for the eagle-eyed viewer. Also, this detail of the bow tie hat lady. I feel like she's got a hat of some sort, but this black bow tie seems to just really stand out and be bold to me. And you can see it a little in this shot, but not as much. I don't know. Small detail that I found amusing. We talked about Titanic exploitation, which was clearly an idea for the film in 97, and it's still an idea, right? There are companies out there who want to recover stuff and sell it or monetize it in some way. At the time the film came out, 1997, there were still Titanic survivors around. There is Miss Dean here, of course, but she was only 2 months old at the time of the sinking, so she makes a bad stand-in for the Rose character. I think Edith Heisman's a pretty good shot at a stand-in for Rose. She was 15 at the time of sinking. I can't quite remember. I think Rose was 17 or 18. I'll have to double check my facts there. But if you did want to try and find a modern day Rose, it would be her. First Officer Murdoch's death is in the film. There's a lot of debate on how he died. It's rumored that he shot men rushing for a lifeboat, which is what happened in the film. Lighthauler denies this. Yeah, it's hard to say if Lighthauler was trying to cover up for him or if he actually saw what happened. We don't quite know, but some people think that he did shoot some passengers and kill himself. So, as far as small details go, we do see this car is actually a very well-known bit of Titanic trivia. It was owned by William Carter, who did survive the sinking. Unfortunately for Rose and Jack, it was crated at the time, so it wasn't uncrated like this. But this is a pretty faithful reproduction of the car that was on the Titanic at the time. We got our first animated film, Legend of the Titanic from 1999. This is actually a North Korean production. I couldn't find a lot of detail about that, only that the studio is from North Korea. Pretty good animated shot of the ship, but you can see they have the fourth smokestack in play, which we know, as Titanic fans, fourth smokestack was fake. So it wouldn't be producing smoke like we see here. Yeah, this is just a pretty dreadful children's movie. Pretty basic animation. You know, the plot is all over the place. It's got human characters, but also animal characters like this talking mouse. The really only true thing that happens is the ship sinks, but everyone's saved, oddly enough. Yeah, as far as small details go, we've got the band. We know the band dies, but this film presupposes that the band survived with their own lifeboat. I mentioned it's a wild movie. An octopus comes and holds the Titanic together while everyone escapes. One of the main characters communicates with dolphins. Yeah, I suppose that's just how North Korea does things. We do have another animated film, Titanic: The Legend Goes On. Animated musical, and there's actually two versions of this. If you're going to watch it, I'd suggest the 70-minute version because I don't see how the 82-minute version would be any better. There's also a ton of posters for this. I don't know if it's because of the international distribution of it, but I just found so many posters of the same film, but all mostly different. Pretty decent ship shot. You know, again, we see the mistake with the fourth smokestack, but I guess it's just a thing for animated films to get that wrong. Yeah, aggressively bad. A lot of weird stuff in this film. Also, the Titanic... the Titanic does sink in this film. That's about it. We see Captain Smith show up, but basically no other famous characters. Yeah, there's a rapping dog, and the animals are playing instruments. It's all over the place. It does have the grand staircase, though, which is pretty cool. Of course, it's famous in the 97 Titanic film. We don't have pictures of what the Titanic staircase looked like. We assume it looks like the Olympics staircase, which is seen here. And White Star advertised it as if it was the same, so it's likely the same, but we just don't have pictures of it. Thumbtanic. This is a part of a series of comedy sort of parodies of Titanic films. It's about 30 minutes. Yeah, basically the whole shtick here is all the characters are played by fingers. Decent CG ship. Not amazing. It's kind of funny. I did laugh, and it roughly parodies the 1997 film, but as far as accuracy goes, yeah, the ship sinks. That's about it. It does have the scene I referenced earlier of Andrews and the captain getting together and showing the damage, although for some reason it's a monkey. We've got a 4-part miniseries called Titanic in 2012. So this was for the 100th anniversary of the sinking of the Titanic. It's got all your favorite British actors. We've got future companions of the Doctor in here and other people who showed up on Doctor Who. It's written by Julian Fellows, so you know I love Down Abbey, but he's got a particular writing style, and it's present here. It's got a cool sort of multiple storylines that all converge at the end. And very good ship shot. Cool set. It's pretty cool. Doesn't break any new ground. There's some good post-sinking content. Nothing egregiously wrong. It's kind of just average Titanic. I think the completionist would watch it, but a lot of people could skip it. One of the small details it does cover is the captain giving Sunday service. We know the Titanic struck the iceberg on the 14th, which was a Sunday, so Captain Smith was doing the service that day. There's this neat little, almost a docudrama called Saving the Titanic. It's all about the crew, the stokers and the electricians trying to keep the ship's lights on. Decent ship, kind of maybe a little too shiny, but, it's okay for government work. Interesting subject, a little low budget. It's sort of fun to see just how little information the crew was getting and the decisions they were making based on that. It does feature, and it's the only one to feature, Joseph Bell. He was the chief engineer on the Titanic. And he's noted for working to keeping the boilers running that night. So that's the end of all the specific Titanic films. There are a number of Titanic adjacent films which have the Titanic somewhat in them, but it's not the whole story. I think of these, Raise the Titanic is the best because they actually raise the Titanic. It's a pretty fun film, but yeah, not about the sinking, really. Also, Titanic Blood and Steel is about the building of the Titanic, so you get the whole life cycle if you like. It's also 12 episodes. It's crazy long. There are a couple, I call them future Titanics. Basically, the Titanic shows up in the future. Yeah, not really a lot to say about these. I mean, there's, a rather famous Doctor Who episode. Well, I don't know if it's famous, but it's relatively recent. Titanic on stage. Yeah, we talked about the Berg as being the inspiration for one of the Titanic movies. I tried to find this. I could not. It's rather old, so if you know where it is, let me know. If it's anywhere close to the film, it's probably pretty boring. Unsinkable Molly Brown. Right, we looked at the musical. This is that musical. Pretty popular, a bunch of runs. It's really just about Molly Brown. It's not really about the Titanic. The Titanic's sort of a really bit part in this, so it arguably shouldn't be included, but she's really famous for being on the Titanic, so I think I had to include it. We've got Titanic 1974 by Christopher Durang. This is only one act, and it's very, very strange. Interestingly enough, Sigourney Weaver was part of the initial production of this. She's apparently big into film, and Christopher Durang was a big fan of hers, so we have a couple set photos of her, which is cool. Really, all you need to know about this play is this line: enter the captain in his underwear with the slice of bread stuck on the dildo on his forehead. This is scene 5, if you'd like to look it up. What did Christopher Durang have to say about this? In any case, even though the play is sort of a mess, I think it's funny and evocative mess, and I'm happy to have it in print. So, yeah, definitely a skip for the Titanic superfan. We've got the 97 Titanic musical. About 2 hours, won a bunch of Tony Awards. This is pretty good. I saw the 2006 Sydney, Australia version because it's on YouTube. Pretty enjoyable. They have this gangway here, and they do a lot of cool things with this, and it goes up and down, so that's cool. They've also got these sideways sets to demonstrate the sinking. I think that's a neat touch. Pretty strong on condemning Ismay, but we do get to see the wireless operators have their moment in the sun on this musical. I'd recommend it. It's cool. We've got The Last Lifeboat by Luke Yankee. This sort of the opposite of the Titanic musical we just looked at. This focuses on Bruce Ismay, and it tries to explain his actions, and it's a little more sympathetic to him. I saw a version of this by the Tiger Act Thespians. Pretty unique, focusing on him. There's it's a rather basic production, but there's a cool boardroom discussion where a bunch of the major Titanic players show up. Like, we see Andrews here, here's Ismay, and here's J.P. Morgan, who was one of the major financiers of the Titanic. A neat little historical sideshow. And finally, we have Titanic, which is a comedic musical based on Titanic, and it's still running. It's they do actually include the ship, and it does accurately break into 2 parts. Generally follows the film. It's kind of funny. I wasn't dying laughing, but it was cool. Molly Brown shows up to share sex tips. That's probably not accurate, but it was funny. Titanic in video games. Yeah, so there's a text adventure that I couldn't find, Dateline Titanic. Plays the captain, save passengers, acquire loot. I suspect it's rather basic for 1982, but if you can find it, let me know. Beyond the Titanic is another Titanic text adventure. I played a little bit of this. I got into a lifeboat and I tried to take some rope and then I died. So, seems pretty hard. Yeah, pretty hard. Titanic Adventure at a Time is probably the most famous of the Titanic video games. Point and click, miss-like, kind of like, you click and you go to one scene, then you click and you go to another one. It's a spy adventure. It's got multiple endings. It's pretty cool. Decent CG ship shots for the time, I'll say. Kind of an unspectacular iceberg, but yeah, pretty fun. You do spend a lot of time wandering about. The whole ship is modeled more or less, which is cool. And it's also fully voice acted, which is a little interesting for the time. There are some weird mini games, like you have to fence this guy or you have to send a telegraph. Pretty accurate, though. It did perpetuate this myth that Titanic was built with weak steel. That's not true. We know Titanic's sister ships, which were built with the same steel, actually had pretty long service lives. It's also got this like cool lip syncing thing where I don't even know how to describe it. They have like different frames of animation for each line. It's cool. It's cool for the time. And yeah, small details. The car shows up. It's blue, not red like in the movies, unfortunately, but it is part of a puzzle you saw, and as you can see, it is correctly indicated to the right owner. There are a number of hidden object games, which I just skipped. Titanic as a setting for a hidden object game is, I suppose, somewhat interesting, but ultimately these games don't really have a lot to offer story-wise. And there are a couple walking simulator games, which, kind of neat to, I guess, experience the sinking, but again, don't offer a lot in the way of sort of gameplay, story. Yeah, there's some cheap mobile games, people trying to cash in, like this puzzle game. And there's a couple games coming out. Most notably, there's this really ambitious Mafia 1 mod. It's been in development forever. Who knows if it'll come out. But they have produced, like, the first act, so maybe. And there are a couple Titanic-adjacent video game sort of things. I think there are a number of try and find the Titanics, which are cool, but none of them really involve the sinking, so they're adjacent. There's also, most notably, Starship Titanic, written and designed by Douglas Adams. That's a cool game, but of course, that's not the Titanic, so not going to cover it. Yeah, and there was also this weird one. I think this is a joke. I'm not totally sure. It's like a platforming falling block game. I don't know why in '99 people would still be developing for the ZX Spectrum, but it showed up in my research, so I'm including it here. Titanic and audio dramas. Yeah, cool Titanic radio drama from South Africa. Rather documentary-like. Done by the Springbok Radio Company. You can find it online. It's okay. Basically not going to cover any new ground. The Wreck of the Titan. This arguably shouldn't be included because the Titanic technically doesn't sink in this one. It's the Titan that sinks. It's about the Sixth Doctor, Colin Baker. They basically land unexpectedly on the Titanic and then have to figure out why they're there. Ends on a cliffhanger because it's part of a whole series of audio dramas. If you're big into Doctor Who, I'd recommend it, but probably a skip. There's a cool murder mystery on the Titanic by Cornelius and Barnaby. Pretty engaging 1-hour murder mystery if you like murder mysteries. And there's Titanic Waif by Darby Kern. It's a bit more drama than disaster. It's about a father trying to basically steal his kids to America. Yeah, like I said, more drama than disaster. Wouldn't really recommend it. Titanic and board games. Oddly enough, there are a ton of Titanic board games. Starting with this one, The Sinking of the Titanic. I found this at a flea market, and it really sort of ignited my passion for Titanic and cardboard. You save passengers, and then you escape the Titanic and survive in lifeboats. That first half is pretty interesting. It's got this really cool ship sinking mechanic where the ship slowly sinks along the board. That's neat, but simple. The surviving in lifeboats thing, not terribly interesting. Pretty basic. There's a Clue-like Titanic game I couldn't find, which is cool. Probably goes well with the murder mystery drama. There is the 1998 Titanic the board game. You have to collect items and escape. There's really no sinking time limit, but it's assumed that the ship is sinking. It's a little strange. It's pretty dull. It relies a lot on you getting the specific role you need, and that will not always happen. It's fairly easy to get bumped all the way back and have to spend a long time trying to get to the front of the ship again. I wouldn't recommend it. Also, there's this weird... A lot of the characters are tropes, which might have been okay for 98, but seems a little out of place nowadays. There are a bunch of Save the Passenger games, which I couldn't find. Hopefully I'll see them in the dealer's room. But they all seem sort of the same, but coming out in different years. So I'll have to play them to report back. We've also got the Titanic Historical Society trivia game. Yeah, this is Trivial Pursuit. It's extremely pedantic, but it is the most accurate Titanic board game you'll ever play. It's very hard. I was able to get some questions right as a Titanic fan. My friends struggled, even playing on the lowest difficulty level. But there are multiple guess questions, so you've got a shot, even if you don't know a lot about Titanic. There's Sink the Titanic, where you play as an iceberg. Really cool idea. Couldn't find this game. There's an escape room, which, as best as I can figure, is a bunch of sort of escape puzzles that you have to solve. I don't think there's a ton of replayability, but it's kind of cool. Escape room set in the Titanic. And then there's a game based on the Titanic movie, which came out fairly recently, 2020. You have to work around the board, rescue passengers. Of all the games I played, this is certainly the best one. It's got a really cool sinking mechanic, and a lot of the cards tie in to the movie, which is neat. So if you're fans of the 97 movie and board games, this is the game for you. And there are a couple adjacents. There's this like dinner party pack, and then there's Titanicopoly, which is just, Titanic Monopoly. And then there's this deck chairs in the Titanic one, which isn't out yet, but maybe I'll have it in time for this next year. And finally, one last bit of Titanic, the Christian comic by Chick Publications, where Chester learns he needs God. And you can see, of course, they think the boilers exploded. Again, wrong. Not the first time Christianity's got something wrong. This comic is just all about how this guy sort of gets rich but doesn't respect God, so he dies. You can order a copy of it through Chick Publications. And that's it. So I've got 2 minutes here on my clock. So what conclusions are there? I think Titanic is still relevant just because it was such a big disaster, but it's got sort of a Shakespearean arc to it. The claims of an unsinkable ship, its maiden voyage. I think it's a wide canvas, so you can tell the kind of story you want to tell, set on the backdrop of a very interesting historical event. And there's enough space to tell sort of whatever you want to tell. I mean, a lot of the films focus on sort of the romance between classes, but we've seen a murder mystery too. So, and there's a spy drama with the Titanic video game, Adventure Out of Time. So, why is Titanic still in the media? I think it's just a wide canvas for people to work with, and if you've got an interesting story, it's probably doubly interesting set on the Titanic. That's it for my presentation. You can check me out online. I have a blog, like it's the early 2000s. I've got a YouTube channel where you can see some award-winning AMVs. And if you're coming to Connecticon, I've got more panels. 7:15, you can see Understanding How Guns Work and Their History. And at 9:45, if you're 21 plus, you can see Does Star Trek Porn Make Good Star Trek? All right,